You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Welcome to The Imaginable Workplace, where we explore how we make work better. I'm Carl Javier, CEO of Puma Podcast, an award-winning podcast production company that aims to spread the joy, power, and value there is in listening.
And I'm Jackie Cañiza, founder and managing partner of Haraya Coaching. Rooted in wholeness, Haraya supports individuals and teams by creating brave and safe spaces for transformation.
Boomers are toxic, millennials are lazy, Gen Z is weak. These are things that I've seen in memes and things I've heard people say, but where are these sentiments coming from? Is there any merit to this? And should we change the way we think about it? So I'm going to start there, Jackie, as a representative of Gen X. Tama ba? Please
Yes.
confirm.
Yes, Gen X. Proudly. Oh, proudly.
Proudly. Are there stereotypes from Gen X that you actually embrace?
That's a good question. It's interesting to me because I never really understood the references, to be honest. When people talk about these big gaps in generation, from my own experience, it just feels like these are very quick and easy ways of putting people in boxes and explaining certain behaviors that you disagree with or that are unlike yours, right? Oh, they're different, therefore they must be that, and I am this. I think that's what's happening.
One of the things that they say about millennials is that we don't commit to jobs in the way that older generations did. Millennials jump from one job to another. They don't really care about the company per se. And I have never done that intentionally. I didn't set out to have a career where I would have brief stints in many places. And it kind of just happened. And then when someone identified this as a trend within my generation, I'm like, okay, that does make it seem like this is a thing. But to your point, I wonder if it's not necessarily because of millennial temperament, but a changing work landscape. And I think that's maybe where we take the conversation is the world is changing. And so generations are just responding to those opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look back at the history of workplaces, back in the 70s, 80s, where the boomers were thriving, that was the era of manufacturing, mass production, where premium was given to consistency, standardization. And so work was defined that way, and you have these big companies that were growing and growing and growing and needed talent to stay on as they grew, right? If you compare the workplaces now, a lot of companies are much smaller and can thrive as well as or even better than the bigger ones, much more flexible, much more agile, changing all the time. So the requirements of the job today is very different from what it was decades ago, obviously. And so you behave in a way that the environment requires, right? And that's where I think some of these stereotypes are coming from.
Yeah, kasi wala naman ako masyadong nakikitang 70s startup scene. Di ba? It's
Yeah.
like where is that? What was that
Right.
opportunity for that generation? Hindi siya present in like a Philippine context because nga the work world was very very different.
During the time when I graduated, the notion then was you find a good job in a multinational company and you're set. You stay there and you build a career there and that's it, right? Today, that's not necessarily the option. My kids who are at that level of starting to look for jobs have much more options today than there were back in the day.
Yeah, and then more industries, much more opportunity even to work
Yep.
abroad and the kinds of jobs that are available to us all over the world. It's
Absolutely. You can work from anywhere now, right?
yeah.
So your workplace can be virtual, your workmates can be from all over the world. It's just a different time, a different time. I think this whole idea of talking about generation gaps is, and I've had people ask about that in the context of workplaces. How do we understand these other generations better? More often than not, I will hear it in the context of older needing to understand younger. I don't know
Okay,
if
yeah.
you've observed that, but that's kind of been my observation. Generally, that's the question I get. How do we understand the younger?
My take on that is basically there's a culture level here. There's
Hmm.
culture, there's language, and the young people, ouch. When I say the young people, that really makes me sound like an old person. No?
You don't
The
feel like
young,
you're part of that anymore?
I most
Aw.
definitely am not. May essay recently about how millennials no longer understand the humor of the internet. And we're struggling with because for the entire lifespan of the internet, it was ours. And we have just aged ourselves out of it and we don't understand it anymore. And it's true. So I know that we were trying to connect na, this is a bigger thing. The work world is something that we attribute to, but also culture is constantly changing and it's changing much faster now. And I do think it's valid, especially because when older people in the workforce maybe want to seem cool, like I kind of want people to still think I'm cool, right? But also, they want to be able to communicate. I don't know. I think your team is nice, Jackie, but I
Oh,
know
thank
of
you.
certain teams and situations where sometimes team members who are young will just poke a little to make the older team members feel older. They just let may counting sundot lang para baka nakakalimutan mo matanda ka na, ganyan. I'm sure for everybody, that's a point of sensitivity, yung getting older, no longer being a part of what is fresh or new. And that does lend a level of vulnerability. So I feel like even as we show how we're all similar, we have to acknowledge there's really gaps. There's really going to be culture gaps.
I think what you're referring to is just differences in human experience. Every individual,
Interesting
every
one.
person goes through their own unique human experiences. And the combination of that makes them who they are, drives how they behave today, how they think, mindsets they have, the jokes that they respond to, the music that they enjoy, etc. Right? And that can happen across generations, that can happen across geographies, that can happen across genders, lots of different cuts and ways of segmenting if we were really sensitive about that. I think ultimately it is about differences. And if we learn to deal with those differences and we're aware that this is how someone else has experienced their life and it is different from mine, the acknowledgement of that, I think, could go a long, long way.
Yeah, I think that's where that question that you get comes from the older ones. That how do I bridge this cultural divide, which often seems so big? And I think that's where our conversation is really going to be important here. Is it's an acknowledgement that those things are different. Like when you leave the workplace, old people are going home. I'm going home. I'm going to bed by 9. And the young people, they're starting to go out at 10. And that's sort of the way of things. And they're going to this place instead of that place. But once we go into the workplace, what are ways that we can bridge these divides so that it doesn't feel like we are so different? While
Yeah.
acknowledging there's going to be these differences, but when there are gaps, when there are opportunities to connect, how do we better connect once we are in the workplace together with people of different generations?
Yeah, I guess some of the questions that I might ask is what can I learn from these people who might seem different from me? How can I understand their perspective? How can I share my perspective in a way that is helpful? How can we create better collaboration because of these differences, not in spite of? I think those are some ways that you could at least get to a better place of managing through, right, all of these differences.
I've observed something in the
Mm.
many events that I go to, which is when it's time for taking a picture, kahit na matatanda yung karamihan, one person will say, sino yung Gen Z, iabot niyo yung phone. Kasi sila yung marunong. para
Oh my
makapag-selfie
gosh,
tayo
that's
na
so true.
maayos. Diba? And so I wonder if that's like a little example of how we think about these differences. Like they have picked up these skills that have
Yeah.
not been natural to people who have not grown up in this world. And so I may be embracing that that is a skill that is there. And for yung mga younger people naman, minsan ang sakit magsalita tungkol sa mga matatanda na nahihirapan sa technology. I've seen people be impatient with people who struggle with tech.
Yeah.
And so definitely like there's that level of understanding. And also, I don't know, I struggle as a middle-aged straight guy to really understand and treat people in a way that is appropriately progressive and caring. And
Mm,
sometimes there is, I think there's a fear that I see from like people of my profile of like, I might say the wrong thing, so I won't engage na lang or I won't try.
mm,
So there is that. There's these opportunities for us to bridge these divides. And maybe yung that's what we need to be thinking about is how do I open the conversation? How do I relate better without
yeah.
sounding weird? Because sa totoo lang, with someone of my profile, if I go start talking to the new person in her like early 20s, mukha lang akong creepy sometimes.
Well, I appreciate the term that you used, which is appropriately progressive. Um, that was not a
I'm
term
glad.
that
I'm glad.
existed.
Akala ko creepy. So,
No, I that wasn't the term that existed long ago, right?
mm,
You could make different kinds of jokes back then, and you
not
would not get
okay.
canceled. Canceled even wasn't a word back then,
Mm,
right? Obviously, there's different times now. So I have conversations with my two daughters who are both Gen Z,
mm,
and they always rib me about the stuff that I don't understand, language that I don't relate to. And when I have questions, because I try to ask questions, I really
mm.
want to understand, like, when you say this, what does that mean, and why do you use this term instead of that? Even the use of they as a pronoun, they used to be plural in my day, right? But now it's not
Yeah.
necessarily so. So when I try to understand that, they'll laugh and they'll kind of make fun of
Is there a
me.
thing where they've ever said, "Mom, don't use that na lang"?
Oh yeah, a lot. Well, more my husband than me.
Okay.
Because nga he's cool eh, 'di ba? He's cool, so he uses all the terms. I'll use it jokingly, but I also tell them, I said, "Look, I'm trying to understand your
Mm-hmm.
perspective and where you're coming from and why you're using this language and you're behaving in this way. I also would appreciate if you tried to understand
Mm.
why I don't understand."
That's great. That's
Right? Because
yeah.
I came from a different experience. And
Right.
so that experience has not allowed me to see what you see in the way that you see it. So,
I think that really requires a lot of humility on your part.
oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not pretending naman, di ba, that I get you and I'm the cool mom. I'm not. I'm not.
Hey, young ones, please explain the situation to me.
Right?
Which is a thing I have said. Sorry, it's a thing I have said at work. Hey, young ones, please explain to me why we are feeling these things about this news event. Yeah.
Yeah. So it goes both ways, is what I'm trying to say. There is a need to understand the current ways
Mm-hmm.
of being and operating in the world. And there's value in understanding what was then and where did that come from? What were
Mm.
things like before? Because it just broadens our perspective altogether, right?
Sorry, I was just thinking. You mean when they had iPods?
Yes. When they had cassette tapes that you had to wind with your pen, right? Nobody will understand that.
Two things that I'm taking from there is one, it requires a level of humility and openness for someone who is older to come and ask a question and say, "Hey, can you talk to me about this? Can you explain this to me?" And
Yeah.
that's also vulnerability. So we're sort of asking the young people, we're asking the young people, "Hoy, pag nagtanong naman kami, wag niyo naman kaming pahiyain." Like,
Oo
if we're showing
naman.
this level of vulnerability, like we want to understand what this is about. Don't go make fun of us because we're uncool. Because we are asking because we're uncool already. And I think that perspective in the workplace would also be helpful
Yeah.
because as an older person, there is a fear of looking irrelevant or not with the times. But opening these lines of communication is important. I will say that one of the things that I have heard from people of my generation and a little bit older, they've kind of complained about the changes that have happened in the workplace. And I wanted to wrestle a little bit with that and how we
Mm.
can think about those changes because I think that the new changes to the working world introduced by younger generations have been great. Thinking about work life balance, thinking
Yeah.
about being more open with people in the workplace. We've talked about it before, not judging someone because they have a tattoo. These things in
Yes.
the workplace that were taboo or different.
Mm.
One of the things I hear is like, oh, well, we worked ourselves to the bone. And I don't see why this younger generation doesn't bother to work harder. And then on the other end of it, someone will just say, but why did you allow your employers to work you to the bone and make you do overtime and all this stuff? So that's sort of where I want to ask, like, how do you think about these changes and how do we get people who sort of are resentful about them to maybe rethink the way that they're approaching it?
I think that is a very good example of us evolving and adapting to what is going on in the environment. The reason why workplaces are changing in this way is because we know things today that we didn't know before. There's a lot of conversation today about mental health, for example, and because there are more people who are going through mental health challenges, we never had conversations about that before, and that's a good thing that we're more aware now. We're talking about it, we're doing something about it, creating better workplaces as a result. There's a lot of other examples, I think, that have transitioned primarily because the world needs different workplaces.
Thing that I just thought of right now
Mm.
is, do you get on a plane and see the no smoking sign?
That is so true.
And because you were saying it's things that we didn't know, that means that not that long ago, but in the moment when the plane you're riding was constructed, it was still normal for people to be able to smoke on the plane. And we've learned enough to know that that is not healthy.
Yeah.
And now it's just super normal. And I think that that's one way that we can frame a lot of our learning about the changes in the workplace.
Yeah.
People moving from one workplace to another because they want a career trajectory. I think one of the healthiest things I've seen is that leaders, managers actually encourage people under them to leave the company if there's an opportunity for them elsewhere. And you would never see that in the older times. And you
Yeah.
see people OT, kabi, like in Puma podcast, because we're built on journalism in the early days, basta kailangan gawin yung trabaho, gagawin yung trabaho. And that was removed very quickly. But we had that DNA of you work, it's Saturday, it's Sunday, it doesn't matter, it's the news. We're making the news. And those are changes that were instituted within the company. Na we're trying to respect people's time off. And I
Nice.
know and that I think that's an important thing that this generation has been thinking about is the time we spend with our loved ones versus at work and having to be in the office and all that stuff. Actually, isa pa yan nadagdag from this generation is very effectively resisting coming back to the office now that we've all gotten used to working from home.
Yeah. Yeah. We found a way to make it work.
Okay, so for all of my kumbaya openness here, I will say that when people are too open and familiar, that is still off-putting to me. And I wonder how
What do you
you
mean by that, Carl? When is it too much?
I think maybe we talked about this in other episodes, but one of the things that has been ushered in is a sense of familiarity. Like,
Okay.
I'll tell my boss about this thing, and maybe that's not the thing that you talk to your boss about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that's something you keep for yourself and your friends. It's a thing to think about because this younger generation is more open and they are more willing to share their feelings. And I don't know. I guess that's where I fall in with Jackie, and you can feel free to, call me out on this or push back on it. Pero kailangan mag-match yung willingness ko bilang matanda to listen to people's problems with yung willingness ng young person to want to tell me about their life.
It is about a relationship, right? And so you can't have one person giving 110 and you're at 80. It won't be balanced. I hear you when you say, I have to be ready to hear this.
Yeah.
And we talked about this before, right? The intentionality of what it is that I share, to the extent that I share. Is it helpful? Is it not? Is it going to be valuable to the workplace or not? You have to be discerning also, right?
I think that goes to the idea that while there are these broader trends, meron pa ring individual level. And it's a one-to-one
Absolutely.
kind of interaction, and you
Yeah.
assess actually how close am I to my boss? And what kind of relationship are we developing here? And what kind of conversations can we have? And so I think that that actually is a thing that crosses generations. It doesn't matter what generation you are.
Agree.
You need to develop rapport and an ear for that, and pushing friendships along. So I think like a lot of the things we talked about, they are opportunities created by a changing world, changing landscape, new ways to be sort of in the world. So I think it's still fun to look at work memes that talk about boomers that are toxic, and Gen Z that is lazy. I think those are fine in a meme context when you're scrolling through your social media feeds or you're watching skits or something. But when you are in the workplace, it's really important to know that, this is an individual and this is a person that I'm developing a relationship with.
Yeah, ultimately, it is about finding common ground with others and learning to understand where you're different and using that to better the workplace.
I'm Carl Javier.
And I'm Jackie Cañiza. Thank you for listening to The Imaginable Workplace. This podcast is brought to you by Haraya Coaching, a company rooted in wholeness that supports individuals and teams by creating brave and safe spaces for transformation.
In partnership with Puma Podcast, an award-winning podcast production company that aims to spread the joy, power, and value there is in listening. This episode was produced by Macy Joven and Jen Horn and edited by Joe Salcedo.
If you appreciated this podcast, then we're sure you know someone else who'd also want to improve their workplace. So please share this with a colleague or friend, and do give us a rating on your podcast app. It really helps get the word out about our work. And follow this show on your podcast app for more stories, data, and insights on creating your imaginable workplace.